Question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The opinion of the chair is the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Clerk will read.
Page 26, line 20, Title 17, Innovative Technology Loan Guarantee Program. Sums derived from amounts received from borrowers pursuant to the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Loan Program. $6 million to remain available until September 30th, 2015.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia, page 28, line 1, after the dollar amount, insert reduced by $0. Page 60, line 12, after the dollar amount, insert increased by $6 million.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment eliminates the remaining funding for the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing Loan Program, transferring $6 million to the spending reduction account. Since 2008, the U.S. government has been in the business of lending money to build cars that no one wants to buy. For instance, $50 million went to the Vehicle Production Group for natural gas minivans. That company failed. Meanwhile, $190 million went to Fisker Automotive to make electric cars that catch on fire. For instance, the Karma, Fisker's hybrid electric luxury sedan, which cost around $100,000 apiece, was recalled to fix a hose connection that allowed coolant leaks into the battery chamber, causing an electrical short. Fortunately, no one was hurt before production was ended. But unfortunately, taxpayers got back only a fraction of the payout. Mr. Chairman, I'm 100% supportive of the automobile industry producing more fuel-efficient automobiles. However, there is simply no good reason that the federal government should be subsidizing billion-dollar companies at a time when our nation is broke. It is time that we begin to reverse this disturbing trend of energy loan programs for companies and let the automobile industry succeed or fail in the marketplace on its own merits. We have to stop these kind of subsidies, particularly in these hard times when our nation is in an economic emergency. I urge support of this common sense amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Move to strike the last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the amendment. While I appreciate the gentleman's position on the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Program, and certainly some of his knowledge of the program is entirely accurate, the elimination of this funding would hurt federal oversight of the more than $8 billion in loans already given. As our committee report states, there are no new applications for this program, and the Department of Energy doesn't expect any. The committee recommendation includes $6 million as a reasonable amount to provide oversight and direction to the existing loan portfolio, and no more. So I must oppose the gentleman's amendment to ensure proper oversight of taxpayers' funding that's already out there in the form of loans, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentleman from Georgia.
I request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia will be postponed. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas rise? Clerk will read.
Page 28, line 3, Departmental Administration, $187,863,000 to remain available until September 30th, 2015.
I have an amendment at the desk.
What purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas rise? Or gentleman from New Jersey?
I ask that the clerk continue to read. Read the amendment, please.
Clerk will report the amendment. Will the gentlewoman specify the amendment to be offered?
The amendment, Mr. Chairman, starts on page 28, line 10. After the dollar amount, insert increase by $1 million. Then page 29, line 21, and reduce by $1.2 million. It is 243 XML.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas, page 28, line 10. After the dollar amount, insert increase by $1 million. Page 29, line 21. After the dollar amount, insert reduce by $1,200,000.
Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I too want to add my appreciation to the committee's work. It's tough work. It's important work because this is how we serve the American people. And I ask my colleagues to discuss with me or follow my discussion on the importance of the amendment that I offer, because it is an amendment that takes its funding from a source of funding that has been discussed previously, and that is the Atomic Energy Defense Activities National Nuclear Security Administration, but it does take these monies and it uses in a very constructive manner. It is monies to maintain for environmental justice that go to historically black colleges and universities, minority serving institutions, tribal colleges, and other organizations. This is imperative in preserving sustainability and growth of the community and environment. Mr. Chairman, that is the intent, the simple intent, that alongside of the important work of this appropriations of energy and water, there is the constant need to be assured that our communities are protected. Let me cite just a few examples as we proceed. Many of us understand the recent tragedy that occurred not in this country, but recently occurred in Canada, where areas were wiped out. This is an important highlight for what the environmental justice is all about. Many of us have heard in the years past of Buffalo Creek disaster. This is what environmental justice does. It is to fund programs that are vital to ensuring that minority groups are not placed at a disadvantage when it comes to the environment and the continued preservation of their homes. But it goes further. It is underserved areas. It is as much important to preserve areas in Appalachia, in the Delta, in places where poor communities cannot, if you will, represent themselves. Through education about the importance of environmental sustainability, we can promote a broader understanding of science and how citizens can improve their surroundings. What better group than historically black colleges, minority-serving institutions that include Hispanic-serving institutions, and tribal colleges? Why are they the best to move in that direction? Primarily because they communicate with those underserved communities. Funds that would be awarded to this important cause would increase youth involvement in STEM fields and also promote clean energy, weatherization, cleanup, and asset revitalization. These improvements will provide protection to our most vulnerable groups. Many people believe environmental justice has to do with lawsuits. It has to do with outreach and information. This is simply a small program that allows the Department of Energy to focus on this constituency and ensure the coverage and the protection. This program provides better access to technology for underserved communities. Together, the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture have distributed access to information which generates a recognition of protecting the environment. Community leaders are able as well to participate in environmental justice. In our communities in urban areas, there's a need for environmental justice. And again, what better institutions than those institutions that draw their population from the communities, that draw their population from the reservations or from the entities that our Native Americans, communities that our Native Americans are engaged in. So I ask my colleagues to look at this program, look at the if I will, fiscal responsibility that I've utilized in drawing from the program to invest in environmental justice. It's a fair way to give resources to these vital institutions that, to be frank with you, Mr. Chairman, they don't have the resources, but they do good work. Texas Southern University had an environmental justice clinic located in Houston in the 18th Congressional District. But let me be very clear, this is not an earmark. These are resources that can be used by the Department of Energy that will respond to this broad depth of universities, historically black colleges, tribal institutions, minority serving, which include, of course, the Hispanic serving institutions. Let me quickly say that since 2002, the Tribal Energy Program has also funded 175 energy projects. But again, this is limited to environmental justice, and I believe this is an effective utilization of these funds, and would ask my colleagues to ensure that we have the funds to ensure the good work of these particular entities. If I might reserve my time?
No, you can
Then let me conclude by asking my colleagues to support the education of our young people in the environmental protection area that enhances the communities of which they've come, making America better. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I must oppose the lady's amendment. This is, though, a very important program, and I support it. Our committee supports it. This program is primarily funded within the Office of Legacy Management. That office receives substantive funding in this bill under the account for other defense activities. Funding for the legacy management increases $3.4 million over fiscal year 2013. The Office of Legacy Management is the correct office to provide stewardship for the legacy sites. They are the experts, and I'm happy to help ensure that this very important program receives support within available funding for legacy management. And I look forward to working with Ms. Jackson-Lee and working to support this program as we move on through the appropriations process. But I oppose the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. What purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Yes, I move to strike the last word.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yes, and I would like to yield the gentlelady from Texas some time.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady, and I thank my good friend from New Jersey, but I do want to cite that nearly 10 years ago, President Clinton introduced an executive order, thereby highlighting the importance, 12898, thereby highlighting the importance of not only giving greater attention to our underserved communities, but also how we can help our citizens by educating them on the areas in which they live. That falls under the particular count that I'm utilizing and would therefore like to go forward in this instance. Let me just be very appreciative of my good friend, the chairman of this subcommittee and the ranking member. I am very appreciative how difficult it is under sequester, but what I would say is that these entities, historically black colleges, minority servings, and tribal colleges, in the course of what we're trying to do, these resources added to what the gentleman has already indicated, the $3.4 million, is meager in what they could do with this, protecting communities, educating communities about their environmental needs. And so that's environmental justice. It is expanding the reach so that communities are far more protected than those that we've seen. And I yield back to the gentlelady and thank her for yielding.
I want to thank the gentlelady for bringing this issue before us during this debate. And, you know, when I look at the executives that come and appear before our subcommittee from the department, I would have to say that the gentlelady brings a very important concern to our subcommittee. I would not say that if I look at those who have come, they are completely representative of our country. So I'm not sure that the consciousness exists at the highest level for assuring that all communities in America are engaged in the activities of the department. I don't know. I heard the chairman, and there's a concern about which accounts have been included in the gentlelady's amendment. I would hope that as this legislation moves forward, we could find a way to accomplish the gentlelady's objectives in a way that would not raise concerns on the other side. So I think that she has really brought an important proposal before us here, and I would hate to see that it would not be considered simply because a wrong account has been identified, for example. So I would just like to remain open to the gentlelady's proposal in a manner in which it could be considered and ultimately approved. I would be pleased.
Let me sort of clarify, because the chairman has made a point about a certain area where it is referenced to historically black colleges. They are referenced in several areas. I am speaking specifically to environmental justice, which is represented in the departmental administration account. So I'm focusing on the important work that these colleges can do as it relates to educating our poor, impoverished communities and communities of which they have a direct ability to communicate with. And I will tell you, bringing forth environmental experts out of these jurisdictions, tribal college, minority serving, and historically black, is a great asset to improving the quality of life of all Americans. So I yield back to the gentlelady. I would ask my colleagues to support the amendment, but I would yield back to the gentlelady. So mine is one of the references. There are many references where historically black colleges are, but this is particularly, specifically dealing with environmental justice.
And I would often say to the gentlelady that in many communities that are contaminated around this country and have problems, oftentimes they're in neighborhoods and places where people who are minority, who are tribal, people who are not necessarily represented broadly within the department live. And so I think that we have to be conscious in all parts of the department that there should be an inclusivity. And so I think that the gentlelady has done a service, as always, by raising our consciousness to all of the activities of the department, and that they be sensitive to all parts of America, including environmental justice. So I would hope that as we move forward, we could find a way to support the gentlelady's concerns. And I yield back our remaining time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady from Texas.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The gentlelady asked for a recorded vote.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose the gentleman from Georgia rise?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will read. Report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Brown of Georgia, page 28, line 10, after the dollar amount, insert reduced by $9,500,000. Page 60, line 12, after the dollar amount, insert increased by $9,500,000.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would reduce the appropriations for the Department of Energy's salaries and expenses by $9,500,000 and place that amount in the spending reduction account. When combined with the reduction included in the underlying bill, this amount would represent a 25% cut from current levels. Mr. Chairman, I understand that this may seem as being somewhat drastic. However, I've spoken again and again today about the fiscal emergency facing our country. There are legitimate constitutional functions of the federal government which must be funded, particularly those that relate to our national defense. Yet even those functions are facing cuts, deep cuts. This means that prioritization is necessary so that we may determine our wants versus our needs. We need to open up access to new sources of energy. We need to stop being dependent on foreign oil. The Department of Energy has done very little to further either of these goals. In fact, according to its original purpose of being stood up, it has been a dismal failure. Certainly, there are advances to be made in current technology. But in the here and now, we know that we are sitting on vast resources that are so tied up in red tape, it could be decades before they could come to fruition. The House has passed several bills, which will continue to pass bills to lighten the federal burden and bring true energy freedom to this country. But the Senate and administration disagree with us. They'd rather throw millions upon millions towards new sources of clean energy some of which have turned into highly publicized waste of taxpayer dollars. Mr. Chairman, we need to prioritize developing the resources that we have now. Unfortunately, the Department of Energy has proven time and again it is out of touch with the needs of our country. The bureaucrats responsible for putting the Solyndras of the world above traditional sources of energy pull in more than $100,000 a year on average, all the while doing little to lighten costs for American families. In fact, despite a supposed hiring freeze, the Department of Energy's website right now today is currently advertising 31 job openings paying over $105,000 per year. This is ridiculous, Mr. Chairman, and it must stop. My amendment would force the Department of Energy to reevaluate its priorities and put our current needs first, rather than hoping that new, clean sources of energy will pan out eventually. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman kneels back for purpose of gentleman from New Jersey. Rise.
I move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5
Rise to
minutes.
oppose the amendment. Our bill has had many competing priorities with a low allocation, and I appreciate my colleague's commitment to finding more savings in the bill. He's ever persistent, and I salute his willingness to challenge us each year on the floor when we do this energy and water bill, and we're not the only bill where he makes these challenges. However, the Department administration account in our recommendation was already at suffering a $49 million cut from last year's level. Earlier amendments that we did this afternoon and this evening have taken another $60 million. There's not a lot of money left to run the department, and while some may want to close down the department has some pretty incredible responsibilities in terms of nuclear safety and national defense and things that relate to cleanups and things of this nature. And if they had to respond, if you'll pardon the expression, to some of the emergencies that we might have as a nation, and we know our deficit is in an emergency situation, they might not be able to respond on our behalf. So therefore, I oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For purpose of gentlewoman from
I
Ohio.
move to strike the last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to oppose the gentleman's amendment. I kind of think back to the movie Titanic, and there's one scene where the captain, evidently the captain, comes out on the deck just about as the Titanic's going to hit the iceberg, and I can remember the blank look on his face and thinking, what had he been doing before all this happened? And we saw the tragedy that occurred. Well, you know, sometimes if you don't have captains in the pilot house, you can really run aground. You can really have trouble. And already the majority this evening has cut, I think we're down to 147 or 146 million in administration in the Department of Energy, a vast department. That kind of level of cut is going to cause big mistakes. There'll be accounting mistakes, there'll be contracts that won't be overseen. So in a way, you are seeding a very bad future for the management of the funds that we do vote for here tonight. So I think the gentleman perhaps isn't really familiar with everything that the department does. You know, you can come down here and be kind of cavalier and propose amendments. But in the end, we can't absorb these cuts at the department because you're going to have problems that are caused by no captains being at the helm. And I think that's really a big mistake, because this department has to manage over $30 billion of tax dollars on the energy and water front. These are big contracts. There are major projects that are undertaken by this department, and to act otherwise is to really, I think, perform naively. And I think the gentleman has an objective, but I really think that he's going to cause great harm to the Republic by this amendment. And obviously, I oppose it and urge my colleagues to oppose it and yield back my remaining time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The clerk will read.
Page 29, line 3, Office of the Inspector General, $42 million to remain available until September 30th, 2015. Atomic Energy Defense Activities, National Nuclear Security Administration, Weapons Activities, $7,675 million.
What purpose the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection. Without objection, the speaker pass for 5 minutes.
Thank
Clerk
you,
will
Mr.
designate
Speaker.
the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Quigley of Illinois.
I rise to offer an amendment with my friend from Colorado, Mr. Polis. Our amendment is very straightforward. It simply cuts the $23.7 million from the B-61 nuclear bomb not requested by the Department of Energy. The Nuclear Security Administration requested a 45% increase for a gold-plated upgrade plan for the B-61 nuclear bomb. The committee provided the 45% increase in funding for a portion of the most expensive $10 billion upgrade plan. Then they provided an additional $23.7 million. Our amendment simply cuts these additional funds provided beyond what the agency requested. But let me back up for a minute and explain what the $560 million in this bill is actually going to pay for. At a time when we are slashing funds for research at the NIH, failing to fund our crumbling infrastructure, and underinvesting in our children's education, we are increasing funding to keep hundreds of nuclear bombs in operation that we will never use. The Cold War is over. Mr. Speaker, I thought today that I was back in a Twilight Zone episode when they're all like this. You woke up in the morning and it's 50 years earlier. It's 1963. The Cold War is still raging, despite the fact that security experts of all political stripes, including conservatives Henry Kissinger and George Shultz, have called for deep cuts to our outsized nuclear stockpile. General Cartwright, former vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said the, quote, military utility of the B-61 is, quote, practically nil. As the U.S. and Russia work to reduce their nuclear stockpiles and shift funds to meet today's threats, the B-61 in Europe will be one of the first weapons cut. Just last month in Berlin, the President stated that he wants to, quote, seek bold reductions in tactical weapons, a.k.a. the B-61 in Europe. My friends on the other side of the aisle claim they want to reduce the deficit. I agree. But if we're actually going to reduce spending, everything has to be on the table, including defense. This amendment is a tiny, thoughtful cut to an outsized nuclear budget for weapons that do little to keep us safe. I hope my colleagues will join me in cutting funds not requested by the Department of Energy for nuclear upgrades not needed. Mr. Speaker, I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Polis.
Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Mr. Quigley for bringing forward this important amendment. There's been growing concerns, in fact raised by the Air Force's 2008 Blue Ribbon Review, regarding the effectiveness and vulnerabilities of the B-61s. The B-61 bomb was originally developed and placed in Europe during the Cold War for Cold War-era threats. Today, according to General James Cartwright, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military utility of the B-61 is, quote, practically nil. Let me repeat that. According to General James Cartwright, the military utility of the B-61 is practically nil. But despite the lack of utility, the price tag continues to rise. As it rises, some of our allies, like Germany, have called for the B-61s to be removed from their borders. There's no reason that we should spend more and more taxpayer dollars on programs that aren't even needed or wanted by our NATO allies and don't contribute to our national security. These missiles are a kind of saving opportunity that we need to take advantage of. Given our fiscal restraints, we need to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not wasted on programs that don't protect our national security. This amendment is simple. It cuts the B-61 program back to the agency's own request level, saving $23.7 million. To me, this is about as much of a no-brainer of a cut that we can find. Let's do it. I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes on the Quigley-Polis amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois
Yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey rise.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5
I
minutes.
rise in opposition to the amendment. Our bill provides $560 million for the B-61 Life Extension Program, $23.7 million above the request. I understand there are concerns about the cost of the refurbishment of the B-61, and the committee shares those concerns. As a result, this bill contains a provision that requires that NSSA provide a full analysis of the alternatives that were considered. But failing to move forward without the full support of the B-61 refurbishment will put that program even further behind what is already a tight schedule. The Government Accountability Office conducted a study of the B-61 Life Extension Program in 2011 and reported there was no room left in the refurbishment schedule. If the Life Extension Program slips further behind, there will be gaps in the United States' commitment to our NATO allies. In fiscal year 2012, NSA performed a full cost estimate for the B-61 refurbishment, and the Department of Defense Office of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation validated those costs. This was the most comprehensive and accurate performed by the NSA on a life extension to date, aka the administration was behind the most comprehensive and accurate report on the program to date, and the costs, by everybody's admission, were admittedly staggering. But those costs were ultimately verified and provided to the committee in a cost report. The amount of funding in this bill is consistent with that cost report and provides $23.7 million above the amount requested, which fell slightly short of the validated figures. The National Nuclear Security Administration explained the shortfall away by stating they would find unspecified, quote, efficiencies in the program, hence the additional money. While I do support a concerted effort that will lower the cost of this program to the taxpayer, we never received any plan on how the NNSA, aka the administration, proposes to find savings. This is not the first time this has happened. The administration has as a stated goal to reduce the overall cost of the W-76 life extension program. But the Department of Energy's Inspector General reported there was no credible plan to make savings, that the lower funding levels being requested would simply lead to delays in the refurbishment. We cannot allow the B-61 life extension program to be further delayed, given the important role it serves in providing a nuclear umbrella to our allies. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado rise? Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to agree with what the chairman of the subcommittee from New Jersey has just said, and I rise in opposition to this amendment. As a member of the Armed Services Committee, we've debated similar concepts recently, and we rejected them. This would be harmful to our national security. The reason, besides what the chairman from New Jersey has already said, these weapons are forward deployed in Europe to support NATO and are employed also by U.S. strategic forces in the continental United States. If we do not extend the life of the B-61, here's what the Department of Defense has said. Failure to fully fund the B-61 life extension program will be viewed by NATO and other allies as a weakening in the overall U.S. extended deterrence commitment, potentially prompting certain allies to pursue their own nuclear program. Now, unless you want other countries in the world to start their own nuclear programs from scratch, to develop their own weapon systems, increasing proliferation, then you want to reject this amendment, because that will potentially be the result if the U.S. deterrence is weakened, and that's what this amendment does. It's important that we do the life extension program also because under New START, which this country entered into recently with Russia, it was determined that we would be upgrading the remaining weapons. We're making dramatic reductions in the amount of the nuclear weapons in our stockpile. So those that remain have to be more reliable, or we made a bad deal. So to make sure that those remaining weapons are more reliable, we do the life extension programs. The B-61 weapons we're talking about are 30 years or more old. They are degrading. They were using sometimes obsolescent parts. So they're not as secure as they could be. So we need to do the life extension program for that reason as well. So for all these reasons, I would ask that we strongly oppose and reject this amendment. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Back. For what purpose, the gentlewoman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And I would like to yield some time to my colleague from Illinois.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I respect and have enjoyed this thoughtful debate that we've had in the last few minutes about this issue, particularly because it raises critical issues about our relationships with our NATO allies. But let's look at the big picture here. The 2010 START Treaty with Russia, which passed the Senate in 2009, requires that Russia and the United States reduce their stockpiles to a maximum of 1,550 weapons by 2018. Well, let's look at what people are talking about now, people we respect. It was mentioned in General Cartwright report, retired Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and former Commander of the U.S. Nuclear Forces. Richard Burt, a former Chief Nuclear Arms Negotiator. Chuck Hagel, current Secretary of Defense. Thomas Pickering, a former Ambassador to Russia. And General John J. Sheehan, former senior NATO official. All issued a report noting that the United States nuclear deterrence could be guaranteed with 900 nuclear weapons. According to General Cartwright, the world has changed, but the current arsenal carries the baggage of the Cold War. What is it we're really trying to deter? Our current arsenal does not address the threats of the 21st century. Well, let's talk about our NATO allies. Steve Anderson, the Director of Foreign for Defense Policy and Arms Control on the National Security Council, recently argued, quote, "Wouldn't it be more reassuring and wiser burden sharing to spend this money on weapons and capabilities that are more relevant to the threats NATO actually faces today? Indeed, why would allies be reassured by an investment that provides no real military capability and no modicum of deterrence beyond that already provided by the U.S., Britain, and France, each of which has nuclear arsenals capable of obliterating any adversary?" End of quote. The biggest concerns for NATO right now include threats from Mali and Syria, nuclear proliferation, and terrorism. The B-61 can do nothing to address those threats. I close by reminding us that 4 great American statesmen, George Shultz, William Perry, Henry Kissinger, and Sam Nunn, argued for the elimination of these short-range nuclear weapons designed to be forward deployed, that is, the B-61, in their landmark 2007 op-ed.
I would like to reassume my remaining time.
Gentlelady's time.
Thank you.
And would like to lend support to the amendment offered by my colleague from Illinois. His amendment would cut funding from the weapons account in the amount that was added to the President's budget request for the B-61. In these tight fiscal times, all programs must find efficiencies, and the $23.7 million was the amount that the administration estimated could be achieved for this activity. So I want to thank the gentleman very much for his efforts, for waiting all day. We have to proceed in order. I know it's excruciatingly difficult for such a athlete as yourself with all that pent-up energy and drive to have to wait till this late in the evening, but we thank you for the contribution you have made in many ways, including in offering this amendment tonight, and I yield back my remaining time and ask my colleagues to support his efforts.
The gentlewoman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentleman from Illinois.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
That pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee, amendment by Mr. Brown of Georgia, amendment by Mr. Salwell of California, amendment by Mr. McClintock of California, amendment by Mr. Peters of California, amendment by Mr. Promoter of Colorado, Mr. Conley of Virginia, amendment by Mr. Tancano of California, another amendment by Mr. Tancano of California, amendment by Mr. Heck of Nevada, amendment by Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina, and amendment by Mr. Foster of Illinois. The Chair will reduce to 2 minutes the time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, on which the further proceedings were postponed and on which the noes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Cohen of Tennessee.
The recorded vote having been requested, those in support of a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
Members holding a series of amendment votes now to the Energy and Water Spending Bill. The overall bill funds programs in the Energy Department, Army Corps of Engineers, and several independent agencies. The amendment that the House is voting on now would cut $50 million from nuclear weapons programs and shift money to renewable energy and efficiency programs. The National Transportation Safety Board held a briefing this evening with an update on the Boeing 777 crash that happened at the airport in San Francisco on Saturday. The crash killed 2 people, but 305 others survived, mostly with little or no physical injuries. A final determination on the cause of the crash is months away, and NTSB Chairman Deborah Hersman cautioned against drawing any conclusions based on the information revealed so far.
Good afternoon. I apologize for being late. We had a lot to do today, and we're making an effort to try to brief the family members about the information that we're releasing prior to briefing the media. This morning I had a chance to meet with our investigators at the accident site and see some of the progress on the work. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that we've completed in the last 24 hours and some of the things that we'll be working on. Our power plants team is finishing up some of their on-scene work right now. They identified that there was a post-crash fire on the inboard section of the number 2 engine. That's the right engine. An oil tank had ruptured and leaked fuel onto the hot engine. They identified that both thrust reversers were stowed and that the engines weigh approximately 15,750 pounds. Our aircraft performance team is working on completing the documentation, particularly this total station or the GPS documentation. They're working on completing the total station or the GPS documentation of the crash site. This includes from the seawall down the runway up to the aircraft. They expect to finish that today. Air Traffic Control Group has been looking at radar data, plots, altitudes, glide slope. They've also requested some additional information from the FAA, from Air Traffic Control. They've requested data for all 777 approaches to 28 left within the last few days. They've also requested that the FAA provide information on all of the go-arounds that have occurred on that same runway since June. They're asking for this information because it provides us with some baseline information and they could identify trends. Our structures and our systems group worked on some documentation of the cockpit. They made the following direct observations with respect to switch positions and information that's specific evidence in the cockpit. They found that the flight director was on for the right seat. It was off for the left seat. The auto throttles were armed. All 3 fire handles were extended, and these would activate bottles to put out fires because the crew is concerned there could be a fire if they have this crash in both engines and the APU. And so they saw that this was extended for all 3 locations. Flaps were set to 30. The speed brake lever was down, which indicates that it was not being used. Our survival factors team yesterday was their first day to go inside the aircraft. They are removing overhead bags and personal effects in the aircraft and working to document things inside the cabin. There are efforts to sift through the burned wreckage in the section of the aircraft that has extensive fire damage, and they're documenting the seating compartment. There are over 300 seats on the aircraft, and our team is working to document them for survivability analysis purposes. We're working to obtain a passenger manifest to understand seating locations for the passengers, and we also want to use this to help identify fatalities and injuries in seating positions, specific seating positions, and the injuries or the lack thereof. They've removed all of the slides from the aircraft. There were 8 doors and 8 slides that were removed. One of the doors, door 4 left, was outside of the aircraft on the ground at the crash site. The other 7 doors are attached to the airframe. While out at the accident site, I had an opportunity to walk the entire debris field from the aircraft to the seawall and back. When you get down to the seawall, you can identify where the first strikes took place. First, the main landing gear impacted the seawall, and then the tail. You can see pieces of the cabin, sections of the cabin, that are found very early on in the debris field. You can see aircraft parts, galley materials, newspapers, magazines, and flooring. We began interviewing the cabin crew today, as well as airport operations, airport rescue and firefighting personnel, and other emergency response personnel. We're looking very closely at the evacuation. We're looking at videos. We're interested, of course, talking to the cabin crew and the flight crew, as well as the surviving passengers to understand what was going on. Many of you have had questions about the evacuation, and so I'm going to give you some basic background on full-scale evacuation requirements. The FAA requires full-scale evacuation of the maximum seating capacity requested for certification of an aircraft. The test has to be conducted using test passengers who are unfamiliar with the aircraft's cabin's arrangement and represent a diverse range of ages and genders. Half of the exits are to be blocked. Only emergency lighting is permitted to simulate darkness, and the aisles and passageways are littered with pillows, blankets, and luggage. The test is considered successful if all of the aircraft's occupants exit within 90 seconds. The manufacturer typically uses a line crew to serve as the flight crew and the cabin crew during this evacuation exercise. Our operations and human performance team has spent the last day and a half interviewing the crew members. When I briefed you yesterday, I had indicated that they were conducting interviews yesterday. The interviews took longer than our team expected. They interviewed 2 of the flight crew members yesterday, and they're interviewing 2 of the flight crew members today. They've completed 3 of the 4 interviews, and the 4th interview is being conducted now. I'm going to talk to you about the 4 flight crew members, and I'm going to share with you some information about their experience as relayed to our investigators during the interviews and some of their observations that they reported to our team. All of the crew members have been very cooperative and very forthright with our team. The interviews took a little bit longer than expected because we wanted to make sure that they were very thorough, and there were translation needs, and so that required a slower pace. The information that the Asiana crew members provided has not been validated by our investigators comparing it to their paper records, and so this is information that's been relayed by the individual pilots, and it could be modified if we review and compare it to paper records. I'm going to provide you a summary of the high points. There were 3 pilots in the cockpit at the time of the crash. There was 1 pilot who was in the back, seated in the cabin during the approach and landing into San Francisco. I'm going to talk to you about the pilots, and I'm going to refer to them as the pilot flying, who was sitting in the left seat, the instructor pilot, who was seated in the right seat, the relief first officer, who was sitting in the jump seat, and the relief captain, who was sitting in the cabin. So first I'm going to talk about the pilot flying, the pilot in the left seat. He reported to our investigators that he had 9,700 hours of total flight time. He had about 5,000 hours as pilot in command. This was his initial operating experience in the 777. To complete initial operating experience for Asiana, he's required to have 20 flights and 60 flight hours. He had 10 legs. He had completed 10 legs and about 35 hours flying the 777. So he was about halfway through his initial operating experience on the 777. He was hired in 1994. He did his initial training in Florida. The flying pilot is rated in the 737, the 747, the A320, and the 777. He was a ground school instructor and a sim instructor for the A320, A321. He was a captain on the A320 from 2005 to 2013. Immediately prior to his initial operating experience on the 777, he was flying as a captain on the A320. The instructor pilot, this is the pilot who is seated in the right seat. He's also a captain. He reported to our investigators that his total flight time is 13,000 hours. He estimated he had about 3,000 hours in the 777. His total pilot in command time was about 10,000 hours. He had been in the Korean Air Force for 10 years. He reported that this was his first trip as an instructor pilot. The instructor pilot stated that he was the pilot in command. He was sitting in the right seat. This was the first time that he and the flying pilot that he was instructing had flown together. The relief first officer, who was sitting in the jump seat, reported to our investigators that he had 4,600 hours flight time. He estimated that he had 900 to 1,000 hours flying the 777. He flew F-5s and F-16s in the Korean Air Force. He had flown to San Francisco 5 or 6 times as the pilot monitoring. The fourth pilot, who was serving as the relief captain, was not in the cockpit for the approach. As I mentioned, he was seated in the cabin, and his interview is currently underway. Here are some observations from the crew members that have been interviewed. And again, this information needs to be corroborated with the cockpit voice recorder and other information. We're reporting to you what the witnesses stated in their interviews. I'm missing some sections. Okay. This information, again, came from the crew interviews. Approach asked them to maintain 180 knots until they were about 5 miles out. This aircraft has a max 160 knots to put down the landing flaps for their final configuration. The crew relayed, again, additional information. The pilot that was sitting in the jump seat, the relief first officer, identified that he could not see the runway or the PAPI from his seating position, and that the aircraft was, the nose was pitched up, and so he couldn't see the runway. The instructor pilot stated that, and this is the best of his recollection in the interview, that they were slightly high when they passed 4,000 feet, that they set vertical speed mode at about 1,500 feet per minute. At about 500 feet, he realized that they were low. He reported seeing 3 red and 1 white on the PAPI. He told the pilot to pull back. They had set speed at 137 knots, and he assumed that the auto throttles were maintaining speed. Between 500 feet and 200 feet, they had a lateral deviation and they were low. They were trying to correct at that point. At 200 feet, he noticed the 4 PAPIs were red. The airspeed was in the hatched area on the speed tape, and he recognized that the auto throttles were not maintaining speed, and he established a go-around attitude. He went to push the throttles forward, but he stated that the other pilot had already pushed the throttles forward. There was a description of the event, and again, this is from the interviews of the crew, that after the impact, the aircraft ballooned, it yawed left, and it went into a 360-degree spin. Of the individuals in the cockpit, the first officer was the one that received medical treatment. He was hospitalized and released. He had a cracked rib. Neither of the other two pilots that were in the cockpit were admitted to the hospital. There have been some questions about operations before an air carrier and what the requirements are for air carriers from other countries versus operations in the United States. I want to say we're at the beginning of the investigation. We're gathering information that's perishable. We're doing documentation. We will have an opportunity to look at all of that information down the road. But if you want specific details about what is required, what the regulations are with respect to training in the U.S. versus other countries, I would refer you to the Federal Aviation Administration, who may be able to provide you more detail at this time. Our Public Affairs staff can provide you contact information after the press conference about how to get in touch with them. Drug and alcohol testing is required for Part 121 carriers. Part 121 carriers are commercial operators based in the United States. Part 129 refers to those commercial operators that are based in foreign countries. Under Part 121 requirements, crews involved in an accident are required to be tested for drugs and alcohol. We made inquiries after our arrival on scene regarding drug and alcohol testing. None of the crew members on Asiana Flight 214 were tested for drugs and alcohol post-crash. We have a number of family members, survivors, who are at our Family Assistance Center. There are efforts to work with them, and as I mentioned, we want to try to brief them before we provide briefings to you all. I appreciate your patience, and thank you for being here today. I'm ready to take questions.
Deborah, would it be fair to say that you're...
Actually, if you could wait to be acknowledged and then identify yourself. Yes, sir.
So it's Jerry Shee with Reuters. I was wondering if you could talk about whether there was an escape chute that was then inflated inside the aircraft. Did it trap passengers or crew? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. We have heard numerous reports and accounts from individuals on the aircraft about slides deploying inside the aircraft. The question was, have slides deployed inside the aircraft? And in fact, when we interviewed the first officer, he did describe, the relief first officer who was in the jump seat, he did describe a chute that had deployed inside and trapped one of the flight attendants, and his efforts to free the flight attendant from that chute where they were trapped. We know from witness statements, from passenger statements, that there were chutes that deployed. I mentioned we've gathered up all 8 of the chutes that came from the door. We're working to understand through interviews with the cabin crew and also accounts from the passengers about which slides inflated inside the aircraft and why. We need to understand whether they were inadvertently deployed, whether it was a function of the crash. That's certainly not what's intended. We need to understand what happened so we can prevent it from occurring in the future. In the back.
About the drug and alcohol test. So just to clarify, are foreign pilots then required to take the drug and alcohol test or not? And if so, who is required to make sure they do that?
The question is, are foreign crews required to be drug and alcohol tested? What I can share with you now is the facts that we know it. We're still looking into a lot of this information. What we do know is that U.S. air carrier crews are required, in safety-sensitive positions, are required to be drug and alcohol tested post-accident. For Part 129 or foreign carriers, there is no specific U.S. requirement. They are deferring to the country in which those air carriers are based. The countries where the air carriers are based have oversight over the operator, and they also have oversight over the pilot's licensing. The U.S. does not have oversight responsibilities for Asiana or foreign licensed pilots. What I'm relaying to you is some information that we've identified. We need to look into it a little bit further to understand all the nuances. Yes, sir, in the back.